Let's
And we are
see.
live.
Okay. Hello. Well, welcome to today's panel. We are talking about dungeon cores in this panel, and we have our authors here. So, if you guys would like to introduce yourself, who wants to go first?
I'll go first. Hi, guys. I'm Jeffrey Falcon Logue. I am the dungeon author in a sense, but everybody here has done a phenomenal job and a better one, arguably. I write Slime Dungeon, I write Station Company Core, Detain and Extract, and I'm currently writing a giant mecha dungeon apocalypse story.
Okay.
Jeffrey, don't talk down to yourself like that. You are amazing, and everyone needs to know how amazing you are. All right. If you've not checked out Jeffrey's books, he is not only a great writer, phenomenal dude. So make sure y'all are checking out Jeffrey. Don't be bad mouthing my friend Jeffrey like that, buddy. All right.
All right.
Yeah, he's why he got me into the genre. So
He got a lot of us into the genre. The
Yeah.
Slime Dungeon is like the OG dungeon core stuff for sure.
Thanks, guys.
If we could have our next author introduce themselves.
I'll go. I'm Jonathan Brooks. I have a whole bunch of different Dungeon Core series. I think I'm up to 11 different series for Dungeon Core, and then I have two that are just straight up lit RPG. But yeah, you might recognize Dungeon World, Dungeon Fairy, Dungeon Crafting. I've got my Holiday Dungeon Core. I've got my Spirit Core. I've got a little bit of everything. I got got some horror, got some science fiction and fantasy. So I kind of spread myself all over the place.
Nice posters behind you.
Oh yes, thank you. Those are the ones I use for my conventions to have a little extra, oomph to my tables.
They are sharp.
Thank you.
I'll jump in next. My name's James Hunter. I have not done nearly as much dungeon core stuff as probably the other folks on this panel. I'm probably best known. This is a Rogue Dungeon, which is a complete 6-book series. It's fun, dungeon core. I've done a lot of other stuff though. I wrote Viridian Gate Online, Vigil Bound, which is behind me on the wall here. That's my newest active series that I'm working on. I also did Shadowcroft Academy with my buddy Aaron Michael Ritchie, which is kind of it's dungeon core, but it's like Hogwarts meets dungeon core. It's fun and goofy and wild and zany, and I really love it too. So I also run Shadow Alley Press with my wife Jeanette, and we have a bunch of Shadow Alley authors that publish widely in the lit RPG, game lit, and progression fantasy space.
And I'm John Stovall. Sorry, it's Tharsal, which is my Royal Road and gamer tag. I've got 3 Dungeon Core series. Dungeon of Stories is probably what I'm most famous for, Corrupted Core, which is a pretty standard fantasy Dungeon Core. And then I've also done Villain Core, which is a futuristic sci-fi superhero Dungeon Core. And I've done Dryad Dungeon, which is technically Dungeon Lord, like core that can wander outside of its own dungeon effectively, which is up on Railroad at the moment and will be releasing to Kindle very, very shortly.
Okay. Are there any questions for our lovely authors here? Because
Kyle, what's going on, buddy?
if we could get some questions. Maybe I can come up with one. What's your favorite thing about Dungeon Core?
I would have to say it's a unique challenge in a sense, both to write it and then when it comes out well, it's a fun thing to read because most fiction usually involves the two ideas of somebody leaving or somebody arriving at a place. The stranger comes to town or the hero goes on an adventure. But the dungeon has the unique challenge of usually being in one spot. So you have to write a fun, interesting fiction around that idea. And just pointing at Jonathan with his 50 books, you can go all sorts of directions with that.
No, I agree. I think that the dungeon core, and it is one of the fun things, but it also makes it difficult because typically characters have agency and that they can do things in the world, and most dungeon cores can't. Right? It's you're confined to almost universally a single location with a few exceptions. But I think that can make for some really sympathetic villains because I really like playing with the anti-hero trope, and a lot of my characters are morally gray and kind of fall into that anti-hero space. And I think the dungeons perfectly suit that, right? Because by their nature, they're kind of bad because they have to like murder people and kill stuff. Like that's how they advance. But at the same time, there's kind of this defensive posture because like they ain't going out and killing anybody, right? They're not pillaging and raiding towns. Like they're just here minding their own business, and then heroes have to come up and like wreck things for them. And so I think you can have some really interesting moral conflicts with dungeon core characters because you know, a lot of them are not evil. They're just like trying to get by and live life, and they have to constantly be on guard against these heroes that are they're basically trying to wipe them out. And I think that you can do some really fun things character wise with that as a setup and a premise.
I like it as a base building exercise. It's very, I guess, less sophisticated of an answer than my compatriots, but I love to watch the numbers go burr. That's the best way I can explain it. I like to put together fake worlds with fake rules and then extrapolate them continuously for as long as I can make a story interesting enough to justify it. And, you know, everything everybody else said is of course true, but for me, watching the growth of the theme park or making the growth of the theme park later on is the heart of what brings me happiness about it.
Okay, I see we have a question from Kyle. What drew you to the subgenre of dungeon writing? Anyone want to?
I'll go. So what drew me was I love the mechanics of how dungeons work, and that's one of my favorite things about Dungeon Cores. And reading, Jeffrey's Slime Dungeon, Divine Dungeon, those kind of things kind of got me started into the mechanics of how the back end of an adventure. So I love just digging into how and why dungeons work the way they do. And that's still my favorite thing in writing is developing those kind of things and working within the rules of the world that you create and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of what drew me. I just love that background information about it.
For me, it was Jonathan Brooks. I think most of the people on the panel at least know the story, but I followed a rabbit hole that started way out in progression fantasy, went to Lit RPG, and finally went to Dungeon Core, and finally went to Jonathan Brooks specifically. And then his Hapless Dungeon Fairy series is what motivated me to write, and it was actually the building. Like the same thing I talked about is the Hapless Dungeon Fairy has some absolutely fantastic building, and I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but at the end of book 1, it went in a direction I didn't want it to. And then I got really excited about how cool the setting was, and I decided to write my own version of it. So he's pretty directly, and anybody that's read my books and read my dedications already knows this, but he's pretty directly responsible for why I find it fascinating now is because of his one series specifically.
Awesome. I feel like for me, in terms of what drew me to Dungeon Core, it was definitely Dakota's books. So I had read Slime Dungeon and I read Divine Dungeon, and I really liked the concept. I liked what they did. And this was like kind of early days of Lit RPG before a lot of the Dungeon Core that's out now. And I had wanted to do one, but I could not figure out a good way because and for those who have read Rogue Dungeon, it's not Rorik, who's sort of the dungeon lord, is not really a stationary dungeon boss. Like he goes out into the world and he causes havoc and destruction and raids towns. I mean, he's a little bit more of an active agent. And I had wanted to write Dungeon Core, but I had a really hard time because I read what Dakota and Jeffrey had managed to do. And I thought, yeah, I can't do that. There's no way that I could coop up a character in one space indefinitely for an entire series of books without driving myself insane. So I had to really think so that was my challenge. And what drew me was like, okay, how could I execute this idea that I want to do in a way that would be fun for me to write and unique enough that it's not a thing that I've seen before. And so in Rogue Dungeon, Rorik is a secondary, is like he's a hedge wizard in a secondary world fantasy. and it's basically a reverse isekai in that he gets sucked in from this other dimension into this MMO where his magic works, and he has to raise an online army of internet trolls to take down the Dark Lord back in his homeworld. And but all of that was born out of my desire to do something similar to what I had seen Dakota and Jeffrey do, but with a little bit more agency.
Okay.
I can't really say I was drawn to it in this particular instance, but the reason that I got started with the Slime Dungeon back in the day was twofold. One, Monster Evolution. I'm really into that, and I have this whole Excel spreadsheet now on naming conventions with monsters and what adjectives or epithets will make things more complicated or weaker. And then the other reason was that genre existed before I first published Slime, but it didn't exist in a way that was solid. Every one I'd ever read on Royal Road either ended too quickly because the pacing got out of hand, or just dried up because the pacing was too slow. Just that whole problem of, like James said, lack of agency, one location. They got tired of writing about one spot, even if they made the characters interesting.
Okay, moving on. Do we have another question from Sean Oswald? Does Dungeon Core make the secondary characters more important because they are the ones who can interact outside of the dungeon? Yes. I think that ties a little bit within what James was saying. So, who wants to take this question?
I'll start this one. I would definitely say yes. That was the reason why I created the Dungeon Pixie race in the Slime Dungeons, was because it was already hard enough just to have a singular location, which it's a sentient location as well, right? Technically, it's not a character. You have to develop the location to a character. But if I didn't have the secondary character of the Dungeon Pixie, then it would be a monologue instead of a dialogue kind of a book. And that would have just made things even harder. At that point, it would have been easier to write it in first person as opposed to third person. But having the partner character allows a in-universe reason for things to be explained and an in-universe reason for things to happen outside of the dungeon's control, but not necessarily, by the whims of fate, or in this case, us writing in that this has to happen. The partner can interact with the world and cause things to happen. So it gives the story more substance, I would say, that the reader can follow the logic of why events occur.
Yeah, I think Dungeon Core stories, by their nature, do well or do better with ensemble casts, because, like Jeffrey said, if you don't have those secondary characters to bounce off of, especially if you're just in one location, it can be a very dry monologue for a long time. And I'm not saying that there aren't books out there like that work, because there are. But for me personally, I like the interplay between characters. And so you really need to have those secondary cast characters. And I think, especially if you have a Dungeon Core who cannot leave their location, having either like minions who can, or having, Divine Dungeon does this really well. Where it's got I can't remember his name because it's been so long, but he's got the adventurer that's basically founding the town, who can go out and do things. I think that's a necessary part of the world building, because it allows you to explore and see outside contextually what's happening outside the dungeon. And you need that for world building stuff so that you have a better understanding as the reader of like, why is this conflict happening? Why are these heroes invading the dungeon? Whatever it is. All of that agency is happening outside the dungeon. So having some kind of lens that you can view that through, I think, is crucial for like good world building and just general character development. Dale.
Want to answer this question?
Well,
that's the hero's name, is Dale. I couldn't. I was brain farting there.
Yeah, I pretty much just agree with what they said. So
Right. Anyone else? No?
No, I agree.
Okay. Moving on to the next question then from Kyle. How difficult is it to write a dungeon that has been permanently planted? I think this also ties in a little bit to our previous question, but anybody want to take this one real quick?
Yeah,
Well, I did
I'll,
this terribly, so I will defer to literally anyone else.
okay. So I like a lot of stationary like dungeons. I do have some that move around, have a little more agency, but I like the stationary kind because I like to be able to build up a specific spot and their dungeon and develop it from there. So it's difficult because you don't have that extra journeying around and stuff like that. You can kind of expand the world through the use of secondary characters. But I think I enjoy having a single place to kind of call home and to build up the dungeon in a way you want to, and you can expand it from there. And it is difficult, but you can do a lot with it. And the possibilities are almost endless in what you can do with just that stationary location.
I usually cheat. I don't have any better answer for it, but the problem is that I need new villains every book. And I get around it in weird ways. In Dungeon of Stories, the dungeon has an extremely unusual expansion radius where it can interact with things miles and miles away, and it gets further away every single time. And so it can encounter new things. It's almost like the dungeon can travel. It doesn't, because I agree with Mr. Brooks that it's more fun to build the stationary location. But that's why I kind of cheat in that sense. And I usually do something to that effect because I find it very difficult simply to keep the antagonist coming in a way that isn't just like bigger baddie showed up to try to kill the core. So
Any further people want to take this question, or do you want the next one? Okay, then we will move on to Brian J. Norton's question. From a world building perspective, do you find it hard to create a meaningful outer world when so much of your efforts will be focused on the dungeon and its own territory?
Yes, I think that it is extremely difficult, and so you have to. There are shortcuts and there are ways to deal with it. The easiest way, though, is again to have an ensemble cast where you have an exterior POV who can show the world building, or who has some kind of concept of what's going on outside. So in Rogue Dungeon, the main sort of exterior POV is actually the bad guy from the first book, but he sort of becomes a reluctant ally later on, and his name is Ponerboner 69, and he is a garbage human being, and it's really fun to write those scenes because he's just like rage quitting all the time, and like it's fun because his personality is so different, and he gives a really good balance sort of to the exterior conflict that's happening inside the main storyline, and showcases kind of the world building outside of that, because there's a pseudo real world component, and kind of the Rorik's dungeon shenanigans bleeds over into the real world, and eventually sort of all of these things merge. But none of that would work as well without those exterior POV characters. There are books that I have read that don't have those and still do a good job world building, but I definitely think it takes more finesse. Like just adding another POV is the easy shortcut solution to developing a well-rounded outer world, in my opinion.
Anyone else want to take this question?
So I've handled this two different ways. So for the majority of my dungeon books, so the Slime Dungeon series, the Bio Dungeon series, and the Hungry Dungeon series, with Dungeonomics coming next year. So all of these take place in the same world. So from that perspective, when I wrote my original 4 Slime Dungeon books, I created the baseline, but not for the whole world, more the baseline of this region of the world, with little mentions here and there of, people and places and how magic works. And then from there, I built on that with book 5 and 6. and I evolved that with Jonathan's help when we co-wrote the Bio Dungeon trilogy, and that was the same world, but it was a different part of the world. But it was nice having a reference document for, time events that occurred, for the type of people that would be in this area, and it was honestly a lot of fun. And it really helps having multiple series in one world because you can sort of build off of that without necessarily forcing the reader to have read everything. Uh, I kind of view it sort of as either the One Piece or the Legends of Xanth approach was what I call it in my head by Piers Anthony. The other one, my sci-fi Station Company Corps, is in space, and it's a lot easier to take things one step at a time, sort of getting the core concepts of the technology down and then people and places, but you don't have to do a lot of telling as long as the show but not tell principle is kept as you're writing the story. Just let things build organically while you're building out the plot.
Real quick, I have to say that I think the idea behind the Bio Dungeon is probably one of the most unique and coolest takes on a Dungeon Core book that I have ever seen. Like it never even would have occurred to me that like that's basically what your body is, right? You have these invasive pathogens, and then they're constantly battling off invaders. Never would have occurred to me. And when I saw your guys' book come out, I mean, I remember reading the blurb and just thinking, damn, I wish I had thought of that, because it was just such a cool, unique idea to dungeon building. So just kudos to you guys for coming up with that, because that's just a brilliant approach to the Dungeon Core genre. Really cool addition to the kind of the world.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Darsold or Jonathan, you want to input any?
Well, just very mild comment. It's funny that you would say that, James, because I was so excited by that idea that when Jeffrey approached me about possibly co-writing a lit RPG, I asked him if instead we could do an extension of Bio Dungeon. So I was also very excited by that idea. And,
it's really cool. Like, and it's such a natural fit. Like the parallels and the overlap between like what kind of, and I know it's like in addition to the immune system, but kind of the overlap and the correlation between your body's immune system and being an actual dungeon lord. That's magic, man. That's magic. It's really cool.
It was fun writing with John. He is a very fun idea kind of a guy. If his 50 books, I will say again, didn't give you that.
I enjoyed writing that because it brought me out of my comfort zone, because like I didn't know a ton about the microbiology and that kind of stuff. So I learned a lot from that too, and I had a blast.
Yeah, I got to use
that is the single thing that would have prevented me from writing a book like that, is the sheer amount of research. I am not a science-minded person. I like fantasy where I can just make up my facts. So I imagine that was there's a lot of heavy lifting on the research side of stuff, but like super cool.
I had to use my genetics major for something.
Okay, I see we have another question from Brian Jordan, Bart Norden here. Also, out of curiosity for Jonathan, have you ever walked into that room at night and scared the foo out of yourself with the Colonel Full of Fear poster?
Fortunately, I have it put away most of the time, and I only have it for like conventions and just this right now. But I have coulrophobia, so I'm afraid of clowns. So that actually scares me just in general. So I don't like it, but it catches attention. That's why I used it.
So real quick, just as a side note tangent on Carnival of Fear. So I was watching the new Stephen King It adaptations, and I was watching Chapter 2 just like a couple of days ago. I've seen it before, but I was watching it again. And it occurred to me as they're fighting him, I'm like, oh my God, it really is just a dungeon core, right? Like it is 3 glass balls that can't leave. And so like it's basically a core that can't leave. And the core projects monsters like Pennywise to go out and do things and lure things back into its dungeon where it kills people. I was like, oh my God, Stephen King wrote the original Dungeon Core with it. That is what it is. He is a Dungeon Core author. I'm going to plant my flag and claim him as one of our own.
You can't leave.
I see we have a question from Carl Stubblefield. Do you find it harder to write the beginning when the dungeon is weak and has limited abilities, or later when it's more sophisticated and there's lore and there's less trouble to survive?
Later.
Later.
Okay. Can we hear from Darsalt first? He hasn't been as talkative.
Well, it's so this is true in any lit RPG, though. I don't think this is actually unique to Dungeon Core in any way, form, or manner. The more capable, and if you're a dungeon master in like a tabletop setting, you're also very familiar with this. The more capabilities that your entities have, the more ways that they can solve a problem, which makes it harder to tell the story per se, because you want to reach certain story beats. So at the beginning, most dungeon cores are very small. They have limited capacity. They make a small room, maybe 2 rooms. They have like 3 creatures. So everything is an existential threat to them. Later on, they can borderline fight gods like most RPGs sooner or later.
Yeah.
And it makes it much, much harder to come up with credible threats. Additionally, I don't know how true this is for everybody, but I'm an extremely, extremely numbers heavy guy where I keep track of an absolutely ridiculous amount of math. Like I have 3-page charts. I think except for maybe Laron Kong, I'm probably one of the heaviest chart guys in the entire industry. And keeping track of my own numbers and not screwing something up eventually becomes a problem for me. So I find later books to be much, much more challenging. Like I can have a cool idea. I mean, I'm sitting on like 7 half-written dungeon cores. I know that sounds crazy, but it's easy to have a really cool idea and write the basic beginning. It's very, very hard to continue it for a long time in a plausible manner. That's actually one of the things I find most impressive. I know we've just kind of been the Jonathan Brooks clapping group here, but that's one of the things I find most impressive about his works is that he consistently gets to books 5, 6, 7 types of things in series. I mean, it's very challenging to do in my opinion. 3 books, totally manageable, but the longer you go, the harder it gets, and I'm always impressed that he can pull that off.
Thank you.
I agree with that sentiment. I think that in the early stage, and part of it's just like when you write a book, whatever you write and publish, those are the rules you then have to play with, right? And you're stuck with it because you wrote it and you published it. And there's lots of times I'll get to a book later in the series and I'm like, man, I wish I wanted to said that one thing in book 3 because boy, would it be awesome if I could do this thing instead. And when you're writing a book 1, when they're new and they're fresh, like the sky's the limit, right? You can basically do whatever you want because you're making up the rules in the world and you're inventing it as you go. And so there's a huge degree of freedom in that. The later books, though, you're confined by all of the world building and all of the sort of class building that you've already done up to that point. You have to remember all of those things. And like John was saying, there's all of these, they have all of these capabilities, which give them a more robust way to problem solve. When they're small, they don't. And so oftentimes they have to be a lot more creative and they have to think outside the box. The only way that you can really counter that is you have to have, increasing threat levels. But then you get into the power creep problems that most lit RPG books experience at some point where it's like, what do the numbers even mean anymore at this point when they're so off the chart that it feels like they've become irrelevant. So I think those are all of the things that you have to balance when you're trying to figure out how to make those latter books entertaining and balance sort of the growth and the progression with all of the skills they already have.
Okay, I believe Jonathan had something to say.
Oh, I was just saying, it has to do with what James said was, you get to a point where it's harder to expand on their capabilities and stuff like that. And that's why I tend to end my series at 4, 5, 6 books instead of taking them on to 10, 11, 12 books like some series do. I find it's a lot easier to find a good stopping point where you could theoretically have a dungeon become so powerful they're taking over the world and stuff like that. But I want to try to stop it before it gets to that point because it's too hard to keep track of all the different things that the dungeon is capable of doing.
Okay, I see we have a question from Paul Pollard. How do you feel about books that switch between perspective of Dungeon Core and Divers compared to Dungeon View only?
So I would say that if you only ever have the Dungeon Course perspective, then you're essentially writing a god view kind of a story. Not necessarily like a literal god, though I've read a couple of those where they literally watch civilization grow and all that. But it's nice getting the other side's perspective, because then your reader can personally relate to what the diver is experiencing. So the idea of, are you thinking of yourself as the dungeon master, or are you thinking yourself as the player, I would say. And depending on what your main idea is, you can go either way, honestly.
Tharsalt, do you have anything to say about this?
I think it's actually been covered, and I agree with the earlier answers, not in this, but just as regard to the value of an ensemble cast. If you're going to have a location be your main character, secondary characters are extremely helpful. I've never written a dungeon core that only had the dungeon core viewpoint personally, and I feel like I've read a very significant portion of the genre, and I can only think of one book ever that I really enjoyed that only had the one viewpoint, and that was Gnome Core. I don't know if you guys it was not a huge hit out elsewhere, but I really liked that one. But that's it. I can't think of any other dungeon core, at least offhand. Maybe it's there, but certainly none come to mind where I didn't think there was at least a necessary ensemble cast viewpoint, which would be the Delvers.
Mr. Brooks, do you have anything to say?
No, I agree with that. It's almost necessary to have some sort of secondary viewpoint. Like John was saying, there's very, very, very few stories out there that have just the dungeon's perspective, because you need to have kind of a back and forth. You gotta see how it looks to normal people, I guess you could say, so that it connects more with the reader.
So this all ties into like the earlier questions we were having?
Yes.
Okay, then we should move on to TJ Lombardi's question. If you
Sorry,
could take
Jonathan Smith, author of Bone Dungeon. Great story, Bone Dungeon.
Bone Dungeon has two viewpoints. I love Bone Dungeon.
So take that, Jonathan Smith.
Yeah, those three Johns.
if you could take one element, character, or item from someone else's world or story and then throw it into your dungeon, whose would you steal and why?
I mean, I've already made my point about this, but I literally took Jonathan Brooks' ideas and wrote a book about it. I already did it. It's a done deal. I loved Hapless Dungeon Fairy. I loved the Dwarven City that was being built there. I loved the interactions between the characters, the dwarf and the fairy dungeon, and I loved it so much that I decided to write my own version of it. I literally did it already. So that's that was my answer.
Mr. Brooks?
I think one thing I haven't had, and I think I'm having a brain fart, but I'm pretty sure in Divine Dungeon, the dungeon becomes like a floating island. I don't have one of those in one of my books, so that would be awesome to have.
I gotta be honest. I kind of like when I see something cool in somebody else's books, I'm like, that's cool. I'm gonna do something like that. Like I don't think that there's anything wrong like with reading widely in the genre and seeing cool stuff that other authors do and saying like, dude, floating battleship island dungeon, that's awesome. Yes, let's do that. One of the things that I would probably do, this is not from an author on the panel, but JD Astra has a series where her dungeon is on the back of a giant mobile tortoise, and the dungeon can actually shift into a kaiju and battle other dungeons that are also kaiju, so they can transform into like kaiju dungeons and they can battle each other across the land. And it is a super awesome concept that I also wish I would have thought of. So that's probably something that I would. It's the first book in that series is called Reluctant Dungeon, and the series is called Monster Haven. But it's a super unique premise, really, really fun. And those audiobooks, for anyone who's interested and likes audio, those audiobooks are all in the Audible Plus catalog. So you can go check those out if you like reading for free.
Dang. I have both of those in the Slime Dungeon world, the Great Golem Dungeon and the Great Island Dungeon. I need to hurry up and write those then.
Yes, there's a connected question. Does it have creature ratings? Game connection to it, like creature ratings. This is connected.
A game connection to it, like creature ratings. I'm not sure that I understand.
I think that that's one of the newer questions, right? So
Yes, but I think it is connected to what we're talking about. I'm not sure what Kyle means by that. So Kyle, if you could clarify, that would be great. But we're going to move on to the next question because got a limited amount of time. Dungeon core, does it always have to revolve around a dungeon master, or can it also be the actual core itself as its own MC? This is by JB Glasstalk. Yeah. Sorry, tongue-tied. Jonathan, would you like to start this question?
Sure. So yeah, dungeon masters, I guess you could say, dungeon masters, dungeon lords, that kind of stuff. They're the ones that are kind of in charge of the dungeon, but they may not be necessarily the dungeon core, or they can be. So you could go either way. You could have. I've seen a lot of like newer stories. They have a lot more dungeon lord, dungeon master kind of things, where they have a lot more agency. So they can leave their dungeon, or they can do stuff that a normal core couldn't. So when you have those two different kinds of perspectives, you could go either way. One has maybe more technical, mechanical type of background as far as working along the system, where a dungeon master may just give orders and just have the dungeon build itself as per their wishes, and just depends on how you want to go about it.
Tharsold, want to take this question?
I mean, the problem is when Jonathan Brooks answers, I usually just agree with what he says anyway. I do think that the cores were actually the most common main characters. I think the Dungeon Lord character was only really one book, the Hugo, I can't remember his last name now.
Hugo Heska.
Heska, thank you, who wrote 4 really great books and then kind of just dropped off the face of the earth. But I think every other major dungeon core that I read from all the famous people, the two, Jonathan's, Jeffrey, Dakota Kraut, etc., all used primarily cores as their actual MCs, and that only recently has the sort of dungeon lord concept really filtered to any significant number of dungeons. So I would say it's the more common main character.
I would say for Rogue Dungeon definitely falls more into the Dungeon Lord model, because Rorik's like he is not really a core. He's a character who takes over he starts as a level 1 troll, and then he has to basically murder all of the other floor bosses and take over the floors floor by floor to become overseers and eventually take out the Dungeon Lord. And then, like, if you kill a Dungeon Lord, you can claim its territory, and that's how he becomes the Dungeon Lord. But he's not really a core. So Rogue Dungeon definitely falls into the more into the Dungeon Lord vibe. And again, I think that worked because I wanted him to be able to leave and go places and do things.
Okay, Jeffrey?
Yep, it's the same. You can go either way.
Okay, then we will move on to the question from Sean Oswald. Not sure you'll make it first far down, but for James and Jonathan, if Grimjack had to go into one of Jonathan's dungeons, which one it would be and what would happen?
Jonathan's got so many dungeons. I don't know. I don't know which one would be the most favorable for Jack to run. I'd like to see him take on Carnival of Fear, though. I think that I like horror mashups. So if I had to do a genre mashup, I think that would be a fun thing to see.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. It was specifically for. Sorry, Jonathan. Did you have anything to say on that one?
No, I would love to see some sort of, introduction into like my Spirit Core series because I had a blast with that. I love the kind of the paranormal and that kind of stuff. So that would be awesome to see kind of a little crossover kind of thing going there.
I wish there were more crossovers, to be honest. And I know that it's hard because they're like IP nightmares and like who owns this thing. But honestly, like as a kid watching Saturday morning cartoons, when there was a crossover episode, that it was like Christmas morning, and it was like, oh my god, my favorite characters are meeting my other favorite characters for the first time, and it was a level of spiritual high that I had been chasing my entire adult life, and I've never been able to recapture. I love crossovers; they're so good.
Yes.
We should talk later about maybe doing a free anthology thing on it.
As a kid, yeah, right. You're not wrong. I still love crossovers. I all the time. It's why I'm such a big Marvel fan. Like early phase 1 through 3, at least.
All right.
All right. We have a question from Kyle Wilkinson. Just a curiosity, why is it that most dungeon fairies are female? Is it just to give variety, or does it have a sexual component? Not trying to suggest harem dungeons, or am I?
I would say that that's just kind of what happened. I wrote Claire as the dungeon pixie, female, because I didn't want a dual male perspective. But in the same universe, I've done male dungeon pixies also. It's just kind of how things come. You can choose one or the other if you can manage it anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually. I think that most of them are female, but that's because most of the main characters present as male, even though the concept of gender in Dungeon Core is somewhat silly. But if you read Dungeon Cores that have female core main characters, including Hapless Dungeon Fairy, my own inspiration, you'll find that the fairies are usually male. So I think Jeffrey's right. I think it's so that you get sort of the two perspective aspect, and it's more interesting to have two characters that are more dissimilar, bouncing ideas off each other, than it is to have characters that are similar. And at least theoretically, having the different genders would make them more dissimilar. So I could name other examples: Monster Girl Dungeon, Garden Core. They have female dungeon cores. They use male fairies. So I do think it's not so much that they're mostly female per se. It's probably we're just writing more male dungeon cores because it's easier to imagine yourself. Because I'm a guy. So, but when there is a change, I usually see the gender flip. So I think it's just to get two genders in there.
I think early on, and I've never written a female dungeon pixie fairy, but I think early on, like that was just a trope. And so I think when writers are looking, they see what's working, they see what's in the marketplace, and they're like, hey, is this a trope of the genre where you have the core and you have the female pixie? And so I think for a little while, it was just that. It was like, oh, these are kind of the established rules of this newer genre. And so we saw a lot of that for a while because folks were kind of following what was already out there. And then it wasn't until a little later on when Dungeon Core really started to open up and more authors started to come in, and there was kind of this diversifying of settings and characters and dungeon lords versus cores, and progression fantasy, cultivation magic systems versus hard lit RPG. And then when there's kind of that fracturing, I think we really started to see a lot of that kind of the diversifying of casting characters that John was talking about.
See, I guess because I came in later, it was a different experience for me. So I think the first 3 dungeon cores I read was Dakota Kraut, which uses a sort of male-female. But then I read the Crafter's Dungeon, which is different. And then I read Hapless Dungeon Fairy, which is different. So I guess it was just sort of a different experience for me. Maybe because I came in later, or maybe Jonathan Brooks is just shattering, gender expectations over here. I don't know. But I saw at least 2 very, very early on that were using a reverse gender fairy thing, but I've never seen similar. I guess that's my one big takeaway is I can't think of a single dungeon core that uses same gendered.
No, me either.
Yeah.
Well,
my Crafter's Dungeon has similar. They're both female.
Which one?
Crafter's Dungeon.
But you have like the dwarves and stuff come in like really.
I
early.
do. But yeah, as far as the actual core and the dungeon fairy, they're both female.
That's fair.
And yeah, when I first came in to writing dungeon core, almost all of them were male core and female fairy, pixie, that kind of thing. And I wanted to change that up a little bit. I do have that same kind of set up in some of my stories, but I do like to have male AIs or fairies or that kind of stuff. But I do a mixture of both, really. I have male and male. I have female and female. I have it just depends on the story, but I like to have a good mixture because otherwise it just feels like it's kind of repeating itself.
I would say that Rogue. So Rorik, when he goes into the dungeon, he doesn't really ever have like a pixie, but he does have someone that kind of explains the dungeon and fulfills some of that same role, and that's Kaz, who kind of becomes his like lovable oafish sidekick later on, and eventually becomes like this famous sort of troll chef. But they're both guys, and like Kaz is, but they're also it's weird, but I did not do that with Rogue Dungeon, and later on he sort of gets a guide to the lower levels of the dungeon when he starts taking over, named Zira, who is female, but the original sort of person who filled the dungeon fairy role was a guy.
Okay, we have a question from Ryan Maxwell. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep this moving on because
No, you're doing great. Fantastic panel.
Okay, we've got to talk about monsters and dungeons. How do you decide, as authors, which monsters should be in dungeons and when?
Hey.
Can we get Thursalt, because he has not been talking as much. Please talk more, please.
So for me, it was copying in the abstract and then finding the specific thing that worked for me. Every dungeon starts with silly little creatures. Okay, Jeffrey uses slimes. Dakota Kraut went with bunnies. All the full dungeon cores use silly little creatures, and so I thought to myself, what would be a fun, silly little creature? And I used naked mole rats because they're a fun, silly little creature that also has a bunch of interesting biological components that could be fun. So every time I do anything, I basically make the first level always has the stupid, silly version of whatever I'm working with as the dungeon's theme. But that's not. I feel like that's fairly standard to the full dungeon core genre. I think it was established by the pioneers very, very early. Even Jonathan Schmidt's using, he's got an undead dungeon and we get undead squirrels right out the door. So it's a pretty standard trope. But you got to find what's interesting to you. And I like naked mole rats. They're hilarious and they've got a bunch of weird, they only use social mammal in existence. So it's fun.
Sean Oswald definitely must have something to do with Kim Possible. I mean, my first cartoon crush, Kim Possible.
Yeah.
Okay, can we hear from James a little bit on this? I'm trying to keep it moving.
Oh yeah, so monsters are great. I mean, that's the best part of writing Dungeon Core is getting to come up with cool monsters and cool evolutions. I think to John's point, most Dungeon Cores, it's a weak to strong character arc, and so like you can't you have to start out with something that's kind of not very intimidating. Like you can't have a weak to strong character arc if your monsters are giant grizzlies, right? Like that's not going to be a good weak to strong character arc, and most dungeons sort of need that. So I think you have to pick something that's a little lower on the totem pole. So like in Shadowcroft, the main character ends up as a fungaloid dungeon core, and his abilities are all mushroom related, and they're terrible. I mean, they're genuinely awful, but they get cool, right? And that's the fun part. I think is picking something that's kind of innocuous and non-threatening, and figure out a way to make it absolutely terrifying and OP by the time you get to about the third or fourth book. And that's one
I
of
would
the best
like to
parts
say
of
that
writing.
anybody who thinks that fungus is not terrifying has not seen a zombie ant.
That is true. You are 100%. And eventually Logan develops some of those corpse stealer fungaloid powers to reanimate victims and things like that. But early on, he's a very he's squishy, and this is kind of what he looks like. His early iteration is a very non-threatening in a world where you want to be extremely threatening. Walking around in a dumpy 1.5 foot tall mushroom body with limited mobility makes it tough to be a threatening, domineering presence on the battlefield. But again, taking something non-threatening and then making it absolutely ham overpowered is super fun.
Okay, can we get something from Jeffrey, and then we need to move to the next question because we have 10 minutes left, and then I have to leave 5 minutes for your discussion. So, all right, can we get something from Jeffrey, please?
Yeah, sure. Monsters are fun. When I wrote Slime Dungeon, I chose slimes because back in 2016, 2015, slimes weren't a monster people knew about, really. Technically, they're oozes in America, but so it makes sense to choose one kind of monster and then evolve off of it, because it's like Pokemon. You start with the cute thing, and then it becomes the big thing, and it's fun to have the different evolutions, at least for me anyway. And that was my logic.
I believe we talked last year about this behemoth slime.
That's in my slime chart. I have my 200 slimes evolving. So it's fun. It's fun to do those is the main thing. But I also have, a system for like a eco web dungeon. So like the different monsters in the dungeon feed off each other, and just like in real life nature, I think is the other way of doing it. But yeah, the brief answer for you.
Okay, one last question, and then we need to move to the author promotional part. From Facebook user, how do you deal with the economics of the dungeon and how great the world, how rich it's making the area, and the amount of money and magic items that flood the area?
Would you guys mind if I answered this one? I love the economics.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll take after you.
So that's my that's actually my thing. Most of my dungeons have a huge impact on the economics of the area, but I think it's really important to consider where we've come as a society now. It used to be that 80% of everybody was a farmer, because basically a farmer family could produce enough food to feed itself and one extra person. And so the entire society was the one extra person. 20% and 80% of everybody was agrarian. Now 3% of our population can feed the entire population, which means that one farmer is basically producing enough food for 33 people. So what's really important is to keep in mind that when a dungeon comes into play, it changes the economics of the area, but it does not do so in any book I've read where it's a 33 to 1 multiplier on what the base medieval area was. So what you really have to find is the point at which the society would develop to because of the difference, and then you have to show, to make it fun and the world building great, you have to show those changes, how it's impacting everybody, and go from there. But it's not really a case of it makes it pointless. No dungeon in my mind, I don't believe any dungeon core I've read ever made it to the point where we have a Star Trek level of we've removed all need. There's still need for things. You just have more stuff and you're moving to the next level. And if you write enough books, eventually you're moving to the level after that. So I find that a lot of fun, but that is the world building. Shout out to Jeffrey Logue here. He's got a 132-page document tracking how that kind of stuff happens as well, that I've seen. So, you got to keep track of it, but it's a lot of fun, and it's not impossible to do by any stretch of the imagination. And there's actually a lot of historical parallels for it.
Does anybody else want to take this question real quick?
Yes. So
All right.
So I'm right. One book in the Slime Dungeon universe with Bio Dungeon is Dungeon Economics, and that's the whole premise of that whole series is a dungeon learning economics essentially. The co-writer actually is an economic guy in real life. So the first one is just building from scratch. Second one is kind of like a communist society for the humans above, the centrally controlled. And the third book is going to be about capitalism, and it'll involve a dragon coming in and, being the 1%er in this situation.
Okay, great. We have 5 minutes left. So, Jonathan, would you like to talk about your promotions or?
Sure. Yeah. So as far as Dungeon Core goes, I just finished my crossover series, which is a series of basically 25 books, about 3 million words. It includes basically it continues the story of my Station Core series, introduces dungeon crafting, Dungeon World, and Dungeon Fairy into the series, and my in a whole crossover series. So that just finished. Got the audiobook out, and then currently I'm working on a non-Dungeon Core series, the Fusionist, or the Magical Fusion series. So that's kind of ongoing right now. Kind of be doing that just for a little bit, and then get back to Dungeon Core. Just want to take a little kind of like side break into just straight lit RPG for just for a little bit, just to for a palate cleanser kind of thing, because I wrote a lot of Dungeon Cores in a row. I wanted a little bit something different, just to get some better ideas. So
Okay, can we get something from Jeffrey?
Hi guys. My latest book came out at the end of September, the second book in the Station Company Core series. I am currently writing a Mecha Dungeon Apocalypse book. I've got it started on Royal Road, and I think this week I have enough of the draft that I'm going to start posting consistently every day and get that published before the year is out, alongside my first dark urban fantasy, so not even lit RPG, and see if somebody will publish that for me. And then I'm going to return to the Slime Dungeon world, and I'm going to release a lot of that universe stuff.
Tharsold, do we have anything for you?
So I've been on a publishing streak for the last couple months, and it's going to be continuing forward. I believe that I'm going to be releasing Dryad Dungeon on the 27th of this month. It's with the Formatter right now, but I'm trying something a little different. Just play with the algorithm in Amazon. We all try that, I'm sure. It's a Dungeon Lord story, not a Dungeon Core. Villain Core 3 will come out probably in February, which is my Superhero Dungeon series, to cap that off. And if you want all those economics I talked about and all those charts and all those crazy, crazy numbers, Corrupted Core is the series to go to.
Okay, and James?
I got lots of stuff coming out. So this is my active series right now. There's 4 books out. It's lit RPG.
Yes, I need more of that.
Marine turned Monster Hunter, shoot 'em up, good time. I'll be working on book 5 toward the end of the year. I'm currently working on a new project that's on Royal Road. It's called The Catacomber. You can go check it out. It's weird. It's kind of pseudo dungeon-esque. If you like Dungeon Crawler Carl, it's kind of in that same vein, sort of irreverent, horror-ish, weird monsters, crazy stuff. So go check it out on Royal Road. I also have a new series they're kind of long novellas. There's 6 of them. They're called Wasteland Warlords, and they're set sort of in the Rogue Dungeon universe. They're going to be narrated by Travis Baldry. The first one releases just in a couple weeks, November 21st, I think. And they'll be releasing one every 3 weeks until all 6 are out. And all of the audiobooks will be in Audible Plus. So they're free. You'll be able to pick them up. One last shout out. This is my girl, JD Astra. This is the 3rd book in the series, but it's called Deathless Dungeoneers. This is a series that does not get enough love and should get more love. So go check out Deathless Dungeoneers from JD Astra if you're a Dungeon Core fan. Super good.
Okay, and that's pretty much all the time we have. Thank you for joining us. You've all been great.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're
I'm looking
awesome,
forward to
Sharon.
all
We
your
really
books.
appreciate it.